History doesn't just fall apart, it slides. Quietly, gradually, until the ground vanishes from beneath its feet. This isn't a story of accidents. It's a record of choices. Across centuries, leaders have faced moments where restraint was needed. Yet ambition prevailed. Borders were redrawn without understanding the people within them. Alliances were formed from fear, not trust. Promises were made that could never be kept. One of the greatest blunders repeated throughout history is the belief that power alone can control outcomes. Empires assumed their strength would silence resistance. Governments believed force could replace legitimacy, but instead of stability, these decisions produced something else. Resentment. Slow, deep, and explosive. Power, when separated from foresight, becomes a force that can't see the damage it creates. Authority has often been treated as proof of wisdom, as if control itself guarantees understanding. Decisions were made quickly, confidently, and loudly, while the consequences moved quietly in the background. Political strength created the illusion that tomorrow could always be managed later. That influence could bend reality without a fight. Short-term victories were celebrated as permanent solutions. Laws were imposed without considering the people who would live under them. Borders were drawn with ink instead of insight. Promises were issued to secure loyalty, not to ensure stability. Each choice seemed reasonable on its own, but together, they formed a path toward collapse. The absence of foresight turned governance into reaction, and reaction into chaos. The warnings were there, but power rarely listens to caution. Advisors who questioned the strategy were ignored. Voices from the margins were dismissed as irrelevant. Confidence hardened into arrogance, and arrogance erased restraint. What followed wasn't a sudden disaster, but a slow unraveling. Economic strain, social unrest, rising hostility. Each consequence was treated as a random event rather than a pattern. When foresight is absent, power doesn't prevent crises, it accelerates it. Authority magnifies mistakes, giving them reach, speed, and permanence. The greater the power, the deeper the fall when vision is lost. Another fatal error is ignoring the warning signs. Economic distress, social inequality, and political polarization rarely appear overnight. They send signals for years. Yet again and again, leaders dismissed these signs as temporary, exaggerated, or just inconvenient. When compromise was needed, pride intervened. When reform was possible, delay took its place. Diplomacy, when treated as a weakness, became another casualty. Miscommunication hardened into mistrust. Ultimatums replaced dialogue. In these environments, even minor incidents turned into international crises, pulling entire regions into conflicts that no one truly wanted, but could no longer avoid. Miscalculation rarely announces itself as a disaster. It begins as confidence and assumption that risks are understood, reactions are predictable, and consequences are manageable. Decisions are made under pressure, shaped by incomplete information, and reinforced by wishful thinking. Each step appears rational, even necessary. Yet the margin for error quietly disappears. What was meant to signal strength instead invites challenge. What was designed to deter instead provokes a response. Political choices don't exist in a vacuum. Every action enters a system of rival interests, historical grievances, and fragile balances. A single misjudged statement hardens positions. A poorly timed decision closes diplomatic doors. A strategic move meant to intimidate encourages defiance. Escalation doesn't require intent. It thrives on misunderstanding. Once momentum builds, correction becomes incredibly difficult. Silence becomes dangerous. When leaders fail to clarify their intentions, others fill the gap with suspicion. Assumptions replace dialogue. Fear replaces patience. In this atmosphere, even defensive actions are interpreted as threats. Timelines shorten, tempers rise, and compromise begins to look like surrender. Each side prepares for the worst, ensuring that the worst becomes inevitable. History shows that crises rarely erupt because all parties seek conflict. They erupt because no one knows how to step back without losing face. Political miscalculations trap decision-makers inside their own commitments. Public promises demand action. Alliances demand loyalty. Retreat becomes politically impossible, even when it's strategically necessary. The most dangerous aspect of miscalculation is speed. Modern politics compresses time, forcing instant reactions to complex situations. There's little space for reflection and fewer opportunities for correction. A chain of small errors tightens into a single, irreversible outcome. What began as a limited decision transforms into a regional crisis, then a global one, driven not by grand strategy but by accumulated mistakes. In this process, intention becomes irrelevant. Escalation feeds on itself, fueled by fear, pride, and the inability to admit error. Once the spiral begins, control is an illusion, and events move faster than those who believed they were directing them. Perhaps the most dangerous blunder of all was the failure to understand interconnectedness. Decisions made in one capital echoed across continents. Trade disruptions led to famine. Political instability fueled extremism. A single misjudgment didn't fall alone, it dragged the world down with it. Systems rarely collapse in a dramatic fashion. They weaken quietly, through small failures that go uncorrected, and compromises that become permanent. Institutions are designed to absorb shock, to correct error, to restrain excess. When they function, crises are contained. When tail societies are left exposed, the danger doesn't begin with rebellion or war, but with the erosion of the mechanisms meant to prevent them. Bureaucracy, once created to ensure order, can become a shield against responsibility. Rules multiply, accountability fades, and decision-making slows. Urgent problems are passed between offices, committees, and departments until urgency itself disappears. In this paralysis, public trust erodes. People stop believing that systems exist to serve them and begin to see them as obstacles. Economic systems fracture long before the streets fill with unrest. Inequality widens, resources concentrate, and opportunity narrows. When institutions fail to adapt, they protect stability for a few while instability spreads among the many. Policies meant to preserve order instead deepen division. What appears as social discontent is often the final symptom of structural neglect. Legal frameworks, once respected, lose their authority when selectively enforced. Justice becomes inconsistent, predictable only for those with influence. Laws stop representing fairness and start representing power. When legitimacy fades, compliance follows. People no longer obey because they believe, but because they fear or because they no longer care. At that moment, the system is already lost. Information systems also decay. Truth becomes contested. Expertise is politicized, and facts are treated as opinions. When institutions fail to protect credibility, confusion fills the vacuum. Misinformation spreads faster than correction, and emotional narratives replace evidence. Decision-making becomes reactive, driven by outrage rather than understanding. Societies don't collapse because people suddenly reject order. They collapse when systems stop responding to reality. When institutions prioritize self-preservation over reform, they trade resilience for control. Each ignored warning, each delayed adjustment, weakens the structure further. By the time unrest becomes visible, the failure has already occurred deep within the system. Collapse, then, is not an event, but a process. It begins long before it's recognized, advancing quietly while routines continue and authority insists on stability. What ultimately falls is not society itself, but the systems that were meant to protect it, leaving everything else to follow. History makes one truth unmistakably clear. The world does not fall because of fate, but because warnings are ignored, errors are defended, and systems are left to decay. Political mistakes gain power when foresight is absent. Miscalculations multiply unchecked, and institutions fail to correct themselves. Catastrophe is rarely born from evil alone. More often, it is born from arrogance, fear, and the refusal to learn. The cliff is rarely seen in advance yet. It is always approached step by step. And the true warning of history isn't about the past. It is about what happens when these mistakes are repeated by those who believe the edge is still far away.